At 14 minutes past 9 on a Tuesday night, with rain hammering the roof of Chicago's Union Station, Elias Moretti boarded a private car he'd never wanted to be on. He was 37 years old, worth more than half the buildings outside that window, and there wasn't a man in this city who'd say his name above a whisper. The storm had shut down every runway he owned, so tonight, the most powerful man in Chicago was riding steel rails east like everybody else, and he hated it. Then the departure whistle sounded, and he looked out the window. Down at the far end of the platform, a woman was on her knees in the rain. Her bag had split open, and everything she owned was floating across the wet concrete. People stepped around her. Nobody stopped. Nobody even slowed down. Elias watched that for exactly 3 seconds, and then he saw her face. His advisor moved to block the door, and told him this wasn't a train he could afford to miss. Elias pushed past him and stepped off into the storm without a coat. Behind him, the train pulled away, carrying a meeting that had taken 6 months to arrange. He walked the whole length of that platform and stopped in front of her. She looked up, and then Nora Keene, 27 years old, homeless through 3 Chicago winters, started shaking so hard she could barely work her hand into the lining of her coat. What she pulled out was a train ticket. 7 years old. $29. Corners gone soft from being handled 1,000 times. She looked up at him and said 3 words he'd never forget. "You're not dead." And Elias Moretti, a man who'd spent 7 years searching for a woman whose name he never learned, said, "I've been looking for you. If you believe kindness always finds its way home, go ahead and hit that like button. Share this one with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe so you don't miss a story like this." Now, let's go back to that platform, and to the one night, 7 years earlier, that cost this woman everything she had. She didn't answer him. Whatever strength had held her upright through the last hour went out of her all at once, and Nora Keene sank down onto the wet concrete, with the ticket still pinched between 2 fingers. The way a woman sets down something she's carried so long she's forgotten it has weight. Elias caught her under the arms before her head could strike the platform. He was not a man who touched people. In 20 years, nobody in Chicago had seen Elias Moretti take hold of another human being unless he meant something cold by it. And every man who worked for him understood that his hands were the last thing you wanted on you. But he lowered her down slowly, carefully, the way you'd handle something already broken once and badly mended, and then he stood up and stripped off his suit jacket and laid it over her shoulders. She flinched at the weight of it. That flinch told him more than an hour of conversation would have. It was the flinch of a person who'd learned that when a stranger puts something on you in the dark, there's usually a price attached, and she'd learned it more than once. The rain came down hard enough to sting the back of his neck, and he ignored it. Then Elias Moretti, who owned 4 buildings on Wacker Drive, and a bank in the Cayman Islands, and the silence of half the men in that station, got down on both knees on the wet floor of Platform 2, and began picking up her things. A comb, a paperback swollen to twice its thickness with water, a folded wool blanket that weighed 9 or 10 pounds soaked through, a coffee can with a plastic lid, which he set upright without opening, because a man who'd grown up the way he did knows exactly what a woman keeps in a coffee can and doesn't need to look. He gathered every piece of it with his own hands, one item at a time, and stacked them against his chest, and his shirt went from white to gray in under a minute. Nora watched him do it. She'd been invisible for so long that being looked at was strange, but this was worse than being looked at. This was being knelt for. She started to say something and then stopped, because there weren't words in her for it. Up the stairs, a voice called his name, and Gideon Vance came down the platform fast, holding an umbrella he didn't bother to open, because his suit was already ruined, and the umbrella was for his employer, not for himself. He'd been Renzo Moretti's man before he was Elias's, and he'd spent 20 years standing between this family and every bad thing that had ever come for it. He was 56 years old, and he was frightened, and being frightened made him blunt. "Sir, the car to Cleveland is gone. Do you understand what that means? 6 months to set that room up. 6 months, and the people waiting in it don't accept explanations." Elias didn't look up from the concrete. "There are 4 federal cameras on this platform," Vance said, quieter now, crouching down so nobody could read his mouth. 4. And you're on your knees in front of a woman we don't know, in the middle of a station, in the middle of an indictment. Whatever this is, it can be handled tomorrow. It can be handled by somebody else. Let me handle it." That was the thing about Vance. He never said no. He always said let me. Elias set the last of it down on top of the blanket and finally looked at him. "Bring the car," he said. "Doyle already has," Vance answered, because Silas Doyle had gone for the car the second his employer stepped off the train, without being told, without being asked, the way he'd done everything for 11 years. The black sedan was idling at the curb outside the Canal Street doors, with the rear passenger door open, and Doyle standing beside it in the rain like a man waiting for a bus. Elias put his hand out to her. Nora didn't take it. She sat there with his jacket sliding off one shoulder, and the ticket held against her sternum. And when she spoke, her voice came out in the flat, careful register of somebody reciting a fact she'd repeated to herself so many times. It had stopped hurting and started weighing instead. "They told me you were dead," she said. 7 years ago, a man came and told me you were dead, and he told me that if I ever said your name out loud again, to anybody, ever, I'd be dead too. So I didn't." Elias went still. Not the stillness of a man absorbing bad news, but something further back than that. The stillness of a man whose entire understanding of the last 7 years has just come apart in his hands, quietly, without a sound, because there was one thing wrong with what she'd just said. And it was so wrong that for a moment he couldn't make his mouth work around it. He'd never told her his name. He had bled on that woman's hands for 6 hours, and he'd never once given her his name, and there was a reason for that. And the reason was that giving it to her would have been the same as killing her, so somebody else had. Somebody had gone and found a 20-year-old girl who cleaned floors at night and handed her the one piece of information in the world that could get her buried, and then told her to keep it in her mouth for the rest of her life. Vance was saying something about the car. Elias didn't hear it. "What man?" he said. Nora shook her head. She was shivering now in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "I never knew his name either," she said. He got to his feet and put his hand out again. "Come with me. Just for tonight. Get warm and eat something, and then you can go anywhere you want." And Nora Keene, who had nothing left in the world but a wet blanket and a coffee can and a piece of paper, looked up at the most dangerous man in the city of Chicago and said, "No, not without Dell." He didn't understand the word. "Who is Dell?" "She's 72 years old, and she's sitting under a bridge waiting for me to come back," Nora said. "I don't go anywhere she doesn't." They found an all-night diner 2 blocks up from the station, and Doyle parked where he could watch both the door and the street, and Vance stayed in the car making calls to men in Cleveland who were not answering. Nora sat across from Elias in a booth with his jacket still around her shoulders and a cup of coffee in front of her that she didn't drink, only held, both hands wrapped around it the way a person holds heat when they've been without it long enough to stop taking it for granted. He asked if he could see the ticket. She put it on the table between them, but she didn't let go of it right away, and he waited, and after a moment, her fingers came off it one at a time. It was a Milwaukee fare. $29. The paper had gone soft as cloth, and the print on the front had faded down to a ghost. He turned it over. There it was, in his own hand, in ink that had been blue once, and was now the color of an old bruise. "Anything you need, call me." And under it, a single letter, E. And under that, 10 numbers. Elias looked at those 10 numbers for a long time. He remembered writing them. He remembered his hand shaking so badly that the 4 looked like a 9 and he'd gone back over it. And he remembered thinking that it was a stupid thing to do, and doing it anyway, because it was the only thing he had left to give her. "Why didn't you call?" he said. It wasn't an accusation. It came out of him almost gently, and that was worse, because Nora heard the gentleness, and it undid something in her. She set the coffee down. Then she pushed back the sleeve of her coat, and then the sleeve of the sweater under it, all the way to the elbow. On the inside of her left forearm, running down from the crook of the arm toward the wrist, were 10 numbers. Not a tattoo any parlor had done. The lines were thick and uneven, and gone green-black with age, the way ballpoint ink goes when it's under skin. Some of the digits crowded together where the hand doing the work had gotten tired. "A woman at a shelter on the west side did it for her with a sewing needle and a pen," she said, because the ink on the ticket had already started to go, and she'd caught herself, one night, unable to remember whether the 6th number was a 3 or an 8. She'd been 20 then. She said she'd rather have it on her than lose it. Elias didn't say anything. She pulled the sleeve back down, and then she told him the rest of it, in the flat voice of a woman reading off an inventory. She'd called from the payphone outside a laundromat on Ashland Avenue. She'd called from the phones in the lobby at the public library on State Street until they took them out. She'd called from the emergency phone at a bus shelter, and from a gas station on Halsted, and from a hospital corridor, and from a phone bank in a shelter basement where you got 4 minutes, and then it cut you off. She'd called on the anniversary every year. She'd called at 3 in the morning and at noon, and once, she said, 40 times in a single day, because she'd convinced herself that the number was right and that somebody just wasn't picking up. She said she'd stopped counting somewhere past 1,000. She said the recording never changed. This number is not in service. Elias sat with his hands flat on the table. Something was happening in his chest that he had no practice with and no name for, and he put it away, because she was still talking and she deserved to finish. When she did finish, the diner was very quiet, and the man behind the counter had the good sense to stay behind it. I killed that line at noon the next day, Elias said. She looked up. That number went dead about 18 hours after I wrote it down, he said. They had my phone. They'd had it for a week. Every number I owned went into a river that morning, and I never got a single one of them back. And I never once thought about the piece of paper I'd handed to a girl in a basement, because I didn't expect to live long enough for it to matter. His hand had closed into a fist on the tabletop without his knowing it. He looked at it and made it open. I'm sorry, he said. That was all. He didn't dress it up, and he didn't explain it further, and he didn't reach for her. And Nora, who'd spent 7 years constructing 100 versions of the man who never answered, watched every one of them come apart on the strength of 2 words and a hand that wouldn't stay still. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist, over the numbers. Then she said, I thought you just didn't want to be found. Elias reached into his inside pocket. Whatever she'd expected him to take out of it, it wasn't this. He set it on the table beside the ticket and slid it toward her with one finger. It was a badge. Plastic, cheap, the kind that clips to a shirt pocket, cracked across one corner and gone yellow at the edges. There was a photograph slot on it, empty. There was a name slot on it, empty. Whoever had issued it hadn't gotten as far as putting a person in it. There was only one word printed across the front, in block letters, and the word was trainee, and half of it was obscured by a dark stain that had soaked into the plastic 7 years ago and never come out. Nora put her hand over her mouth. This is what I had, Elias said. For 7 years. This is everything I had. It was past midnight when Doyle brought the car down to the strip of ground under the viaduct where the encampment sat, and Elias got out and walked in among the tarps in a $3,000 suit, with the knees still dark from the platform, and every head that came up out of a doorway went back down again fast. Nora went ahead of him. She stopped at the 4th shelter down and said a name into the dark, and a light came on inside, one of those battery lanterns. And after a while the flap came back and a woman looked out at them. Del Rooney was 72 years old. She'd spent 31 years as a nurse on the medical floors at a hospital on the north side, and she'd lost her apartment the year her pension got restructured, and that was the whole of her history that anybody in that camp had ever gotten out of her. She looked at Nora first, all the way up and down, checking her the way you check a person you've been waiting up for. Then she turned the lantern on Elias and took her time about it. She started at the shoes. She worked up. Rich, she said. It wasn't a question. Elias said, comfortable. Comfortable, Del repeated. Comfortable is what rich people say when they've had an education. He didn't laugh. He came very close. Nora made a small sound behind her hand and turned away, and Elias understood, from the sound, that it had been a long time since anything had made her do that. Del pushed the flap back further and got herself up off the cot, slow. One hand braced on the frame, and she came out into the cold in a coat over a coat and stood there sizing him up at close range. This is him, Nora said. Del didn't take her eyes off Elias. I know who it is, she said. Now that was interesting, and Elias filed it and said nothing. She's been calling that name in her sleep for 7 years, Del said. Not every night, but enough nights. First winter we shared a wall I thought Moretti was a saint she prayed to, on account of how she said it. Turns out it's a man. Grandma, Nora said. Del waved that off the way you wave off a fly. Elias stood very still. In 11 years, nobody had spoken to him like that. And not because he'd forbidden it. Men simply stopped. They got a certain distance into a sentence, and their own instincts took the rest of it away from them. This woman had no such instinct, or she'd buried it 30 years ago on a hospital floor where people bled on her and she kept working, and either way she was standing in front of him at midnight under a bridge and she wasn't finished. I know what you are, she said. I don't need the details and I don't want them, but I've been carrying that girl since the winter she came under here with a broken hand and a fever of 103, and I'm going to say this once, and then you can do whatever it is men like you do." Elias said, "Say it." "She's had exactly one good thing happen to her in her whole adult life," Dell said. "And it was you, 7 years ago, for about 6 hours. And she built everything on it. Everything. When there was nothing to eat, she had that. When they threw her out of the last place, she had that. You are not a man to her. You're the last load-bearing wall in the house. And I have watched her hold that wall up with her own 2 hands through 3 winters. So," she jabbed one finger at his chest without touching it, "if you're planning to disappear on her a second time, do it now. Tonight, right here, while I'm standing next to her. Because she'll survive tonight. She won't survive it twice." Nora said her name, low, mortified, and Dell didn't move. Elias looked at the old woman for a long moment. He was aware, in some distant part of himself, that Doyle had come 3 steps closer, and that Vance was watching from the car with his phone down at his side, and that every man who worked for him was witnessing a thing that would have gotten anybody else put out of the city. He found he didn't care. "I'm not going to make you a promise," Elias said. "You wouldn't take one anyway." Dell's chin came up a half-inch. "No," she said. "I wouldn't. But I'll tell you what I am going to do," he said. He gestured back at the car, at the open door, at the heater running. "There's a house in Lincoln Park with heat and hot water and beds, and nobody but my own people knows the address, and I'm going to take the 2 of you there tonight. Not one of you. Both." Dell looked at the sedan. Then she looked at Nora, and something moved across her face that she got rid of quickly. "And what do you want?" she said. "That's the part nobody ever gets to. What do you want?" Elias said. "I want to know who told her I was dead." The wind came under the bridge and pulled at the tarps. Dell stood there in the cold for what felt like a long time. Then she reached back into the shelter and came out with a plastic grocery bag with everything she owned in it, and she handed it to Elias, not gently, more the way you hand a man a bucket when the roof is leaking. "If you drop that," she said, "it's got my sister's rosary in it." Elias took the bag. He carried it to the car with both hands. Dell got in first, and Nora got in beside her, and neither of them said anything at all on the long ride north. But somewhere around Fullerton Avenue, Dell reached over and took the girl's hand and held onto it, and Elias watched that in the mirror the entire way. 7 years earlier, on a Thursday in October, Elias Moretti had dinner with his father in a restaurant on Taylor Street, and it took 11 minutes to end. Renzo Moretti was 61. He'd eaten in that back room every Thursday for 19 years, at the same table, with his back to the wall because his own father had taught him that much, and it hadn't mattered. Elias was 30 years old, and he was reaching for the bread when the kitchen door came open behind him. He never saw who came through it. He heard the kitchen door swing open, and then came the sudden, terrible noise that filled the back room. The lights went down in a flash of confusion, chairs overturned, and in the chaos and dark, Elias found himself on the floor. He didn't wait to see who had come through that door. He got to his feet he didn't remember deciding to. He went through the kitchen and out the service door into the alley, and he was running before he was fully upright. And behind him, he heard men in the alley, more than one, unhurried, the way men move when they believe the work is finished, and they're only confirming it. He ran east. He couldn't go to the house on Ashland Avenue because whoever had opened that kitchen door had known the table, the night, the hour, and a man who knows those 3 things knows the house. He couldn't go to a hospital because a gunshot wound in Cook County is a phone call to the police before the paperwork is even started. He couldn't go to any of the 4 men whose numbers he had in his phone because one of them had to be the reason there'd been a man in the kitchen. So he ran, and by the 2nd mile he was walking, and by the 3rd he was going along with one shoulder against the brick, keeping his hand pressed flat under his ribs, and the rain had started, and it was somewhere past 11 at night. Everything in that part of the city was locked. Every storefront, every bar, every lobby. He passed a bank of blue lights on a parking garage and didn't stop. He passed a church with a chain on the door, and then he came out onto Canal Street and saw the great columns of Union Station standing lit up in the rain. Doors open, because Union Station is open all night, every night, for the trains that come through at 2 and 4 in the morning carrying people to Denver and New Orleans and Seattle, and it was the only door in the city of Chicago that a man could walk through at that hour without anybody asking him a single question. He went in. The great hall was almost empty. Some travelers asleep on the wooden benches with bags between their feet. A man pushing a wide broom in slow lines across the marble, the ceiling 6 stories up, all glass, with rain coming down on it and the sound of that filling the whole enormous room like something breathing. Elias kept his hand under his coat and made himself walk like a man who was late, and he got about 90 feet before the room began to tilt. He went down a corridor. There was a bank of lockers along the wall, and he got behind the end of it and put his back against the metal and slid down until he was sitting on the floor with his legs out in front of him, and when he took his hand away and looked at it, he understood, without any particular emotion, that he was probably going to die in a train station. He was 30 years old. He thought about his father's hand on the tile. He thought that somebody was going to have to tell his mother, and that whoever did it would be lying about part of it. Then he heard the doors. 2 men. He knew it was 2 by the footsteps, and he knew what kind of men by the pace, because they weren't walking toward a train. They came in and they stopped, and one of them said something short, and then they split, and Elias heard one set of shoes going one way across that marble, and one going the other, and the sound came back off the ceiling so that it seemed to be coming from every direction at once. He tried to make himself smaller behind the lockers. His hands weren't working right. He got the phone out of his coat and looked at the screen and understood that there was not one name in it he could touch. He put it back. The footsteps came down the corridor, slow, stopping every so often. A man checking doorways. Elias closed his eyes and got very still and listened to his own heart doing something wrong in his chest. And he thought, without any drama about it, that it was going to be here, on this floor, next to a row of lockers, and that whoever found him in the morning would step around him the way people step around things in stations. The footsteps came closer. 20 feet, 15, and then a hand closed around his wrist. It came out of the dark on his left, from a doorway he hadn't known was there, small and cold and shaking so hard he could feel it through his sleeve, and it pulled. She was 20 years old, and it was the 2nd week of the job. Nora Keene took classes at a community college on the west side 4 evenings a week toward a nursing degree, and to pay for them, she cleaned Union Station from 11 at night until 7 in the morning for a service contractor that staffed half the buildings downtown, and she'd been told the badge with her name and her photograph on it would come in about a month. Until then, she had the blank one they gave the new ones. She was pushing a cart down the corridor when she saw a man go down behind the lockers, and she had maybe 4 seconds to decide. And in those 4 seconds she heard the doors at the far end of the hall, so she didn't think. She got her hand around his wrist, and she pulled, and he was 200 pounds of dead weight, and she was 120, and it should not have worked. But he got a leg under himself and half fell through the doorway with her, and she got the door shut and the light off. There was a stairwell behind it. They went down it together in the dark, him with one arm over the rail and her under his other shoulder, 1 step at a time, and at the bottom was the boiler room, which was hot and loud and where nobody went. She put him on the floor against the wall. Then she looked at what she had. She was 1 year into a 2-year program. She'd never seen a wound like that on anything but a diagram. Her hands were shaking so badly that she had to put them flat on her own knees for a second before she could use them. She got the folded towels off her cart, and when the towels weren't enough, she took the blank badge off her shirt and used the flat of it to hold the pressure where she needed it, and she leaned on it with her whole body weight, and she stayed there. He didn't talk much. Once he said, "Don't call anybody," and she said, "I know," and neither of them said anything about why she knew. Once he tried to sit up, and she put her hand on his shoulder and said, "No," and he went back down. Around 1 in the morning, she heard the door at the top of the stairs. She got up. She left him against the wall in the dark behind the boiler, and she went and stood at the bottom of the stairs with her cart, and she picked up a rag and started wiping the handrail, and her hands were shaking so hard the rag kept slipping. 2 men came halfway down. They didn't come all the way. One of them was pleasant about it. He asked her if she'd seen a man come through, tall, dark coat, maybe hurt, maybe not doing well. He said it like a man asking after a friend. Nora Keene, who had never in her life told a lie that mattered, looked up at him from the bottom of a stairwell, with a man bleeding out 15 feet behind her, and said, "No, sir, nobody comes down here." The pleasant one asked her how long she'd been on. She said, since 11. He asked if she'd been in the corridor. She said she'd been in the West End doing the restrooms, and had only just come down. He looked at her for a while. Then he said, "All right," and thanked her, and they went back up, and the door closed, and Nora stood at the bottom of those stairs and couldn't move for a full minute. Then she went back to him and put her hands where they'd been. The night went on a long time. He drifted and came back. The boiler ran and shut off and ran again. Somewhere around 4, the bleeding slowed enough that she could stop leaning on it, and she sat back on her heels and looked at what she'd done to her uniform and thought about the fact that she was supposed to be in class at 6 that evening. At 5, he said he had to get out before the shift change, and the morning police walk through, and she said he couldn't stand, and he stood anyway. She got him up the service stairs and out to the edge of the great hall. It was still dark outside, and the first Amtrak crowd hadn't come in yet. He had nothing on him. No wallet, no cash, no card that was any use to a man who couldn't be seen using it. Nora went to the automated machine by the wall, and she stood there for a while. And then she put in the debit card she used for groceries, and she bought the cheapest ticket that left the city of Chicago that morning, which was Milwaukee. $29, and the machine printed it and stamped the time on it, 5:14 in the morning. She came back and put it in his hand. He looked at it. Then he asked her for something to write with, and she gave him the pen out of her breast pocket, and he turned the ticket over on his knee and wrote 3 short lines on the back of it, and signed it with 1 letter, and gave it back to her. She said, "This is yours." He said, "No." He said, "If you're ever in trouble, that's the only thing I've got." And she said what he wrote didn't make sense, because she wasn't the one in trouble. And he almost smiled, and he didn't answer that. She asked him his name. He looked at her for a moment, and she saw him decide something, and she wouldn't understand what it was for another 7 years. He said, "Don't tell anybody you saw me." Then he went out through the doors onto Canal Street in the dark, holding his side, and Nora Keene stood in that empty hall with a train ticket in her hand and watched him go until she couldn't see him anymore. The house in Lincoln Park had 4 bedrooms and a kitchen nobody used, and by 2 in the morning both women were asleep upstairs, and Elias stood in the front room with Doyle and gave him the only order that mattered. "Nora Keene," he said. Keene with a K. 27 years old now, so 20 then. Everything. Where she's lived, where she's worked, what happened to her, and who she talked to. Every year of it. Doyle wrote nothing down, because he never did. He asked one question: "How far back do you want me to go?" "All of it," Elias said. "Start at that October and don't stop." Doyle went out. Vance was in the hall with his coat still on, and he'd been on the phone for 4 hours to men who were not calling back, and he looked at the stairs and then at his employer and made himself say it. "Sir," he said, "I have to ask you something, and I'd like you to hear it as loyalty and not as anything else." Elias said, "Ask." "Do we know this woman?" Vance said. "Or do we know a woman who's been holding onto a piece of paper? Because a piece of paper can be given to somebody. It can be sold. There are men in Cleveland who'd pay a great deal for a way to put you on your knees in public, with cameras running." Elias looked at him for a long moment. There was nothing in the question that wasn't fair, and both of them knew it, and it was exactly the question Renzo Moretti would have asked. "She's the one," Elias said. "You're certain?" "I'm certain." Vance nodded once and let it go, because that was the other thing about him. He pushed exactly as far as he was entitled to push, and then he stopped. He said he'd handle Cleveland. He said he'd have something by morning. Then he went out to his own car, and Elias stood alone in that room and did something he hadn't done in years, which was to take a piece of plastic out of his pocket and hold it in his hand and look at it. 7 years. He'd started looking within a month of that night, as soon as he could stand up straight without holding the wall. He'd had men go to the station. He'd had them ask about a young woman on the overnight cleaning crew, and he'd learned that the crew wasn't the station's at all, that they came from a service contractor that held the building account and staffed 9 other buildings downtown and turned over 1/3 of its people every quarter. He'd had a man go to that contractor, and the answer that came back was that the personnel file for the overnight cleaner he was describing had been purged from the system, because when a worker is terminated for cause, the contractor pulls the record and the badge number goes back into the pool, and after 18 months, the paper copy goes into a shredder in a warehouse in Cicero. There was no name. There was no photograph. There was no badge number, because she'd never been issued one. There was a blank plastic card with 1 word on it and a stain across half of it, and there was a woman he'd have known anywhere and couldn't describe to anybody in a way that would help, because what do you say? She was young. She was frightened. Her hands shook. She saved my life, and I never asked her what to call her. He'd kept 2 men on it for the first 3 years. He'd had the shredded records searched for, and they were gone. He'd had the station's own footage requested from that night, quietly, through a lawyer, and been told the retention period was 90 days, and he was 6 months late. And somewhere in the 4th year, he'd stopped saying it out loud to anybody, and by the 6th year, it had turned into the thing he did alone, late, with a piece of plastic in his hand, which is what a man does with a debt he's given up on paying. He put it back in his pocket. He didn't sleep. At 6:20 in the morning, his phone went off on the table beside him, and it was a number out of Ohio. And the man on the other end was somebody Elias had known for 19 years. And the man got 2 sentences out, and then had to start over. 3 of Elias's people had gone into that meeting room in Cleveland at 10 last night. The room had been arranged, the door had been held, everything had been correct. And at some point between 10 and 11, the building had gone quiet. And this morning there were 3 cars still in the lot, and no one had come out of that building at all. And the police were there now, Elias said, and Kessler. There was a pause on the line long enough that Elias could hear a television going somewhere in the background of it. Kessler never booked a meeting, the man said. I sat with him at 9 this morning. He didn't send for anybody. He didn't know your people were in his city. He's got his own men in the street right now trying to work out who did it on his ground. Elias didn't say anything. Sir, the man said, that car was yours. You were supposed to be in that room. Elias ended the call and set the phone face down on the table. Outside the window, the sky over Lincoln Park had gone, the color of wet newspaper, and the rain had stopped sometime in the night. He stood there with his hands in his pockets and looked out at the street. He stood there while the house began to make its morning noises above him. Water in a pipe, a door, a floorboard, an old woman's voice saying something and a younger one laughing at it. Low, the way people laugh when they haven't done it in a while. He didn't move for a long time. Doyle came back at 4 in the afternoon with a folder about an inch thick and set it on the table in the front room, and he stood there while Elias read it, because he'd read it himself in the car, and he'd decided his employer shouldn't be alone with it. It began 6 weeks after that October night. On the 3rd of December, at the end of the overnight shift, a supervisor with the service contractor opened the employee lockers in the basement of a building on Wacker Drive, where Nora Keene had been reassigned in November, and in her locker were 2 pieces of property belonging to a tenant on the 11th floor, reported missing 4 days earlier. The Chicago police were called at 7:40 in the morning. She was arrested in her uniform. She'd been on shift for 8 hours. The value of the property placed the charge above the felony threshold in the state of Illinois, and the charge as filed was theft from an employer. The public defender assigned to her had 91 other open cases that month. The offer from the state's attorney was a plea to the felony with no time served, 2 years of probation, and restitution. If she refused it and went to trial and lost, the exposure was up to 5 years in a state facility. She was 20 years old. She had $411 in a checking account and a mother on a disability income in a 1-bedroom on the Northwest Side, and no lawyer that anybody in the world was going to pay for. She took the plea on the 9th of January at 20 years old, with exactly $411 left in her checking account. 2 years later, her mother passed away at 63. The unpaid medical debt and an eviction notice followed swiftly, stripping away her apartment. Elias turned the page. The rest of it was short, because that's how these things are recorded. Terminated for cause, 3rd of December. Nursing program, withdrawn, spring term, unable to continue tuition. Application to the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation for licensure as a practical nurse, submitted 22 months later. Denied. Felony conviction involving theft. Applicant advised of appeal rights. No appeal filed. And after that there was a list. And the list was the worst thing in the folder. Hostess. A restaurant on Milwaukee Avenue. Hired in March. Separated in June. Stockroom. A discount store in Portage Park. Hired in July. Separated in October. Overnight shelf work at a grocery. Hired in November. Separated in February. Home care aide for a private family in Jefferson Park. Hired in April. Separated in July. Kitchen at a nursing home. Hired in September. Separated in December. Every one of them between 11 and 14 weeks. Doyle had gone and stood in front of 4 of those employers that day. And in 3 of the 4 he'd gotten the same story without having to ask twice, and Elias read it in Doyle's flat handwriting on a single sheet at the back. Somebody called. Every time, somewhere around the 3rd month, a man called the manager. He was polite. He never gave a name. He said he only felt they ought to know the girl had a theft conviction, and that he'd hate to see anybody get hurt, and then he hung up. 2 of the 4 managers said they'd have kept her anyway, if the call hadn't come. One of them said she was the best worker on the floor. One of them said he still felt bad about it. 2 years into that, on the 4th of an April, Marianne Keene died at 63 at a hospital on the northwest side. The estate consisted of nothing. The medical debt did not. There were letters in the folder from a collection agency addressed to Nora Keene at an apartment she was evicted from 8 months after the funeral, and then addressed to her at nowhere, and then not addressed at all. And there the paper record of a human being simply stopped, the way it stops for everybody who falls out of the bottom of it, and picked up again only in intake logs at 3 shelters and 1 emergency room. Elias closed the folder. He didn't slam it. He put his hand flat on the cover and let it rest there. And then he set the folder down on the table very slowly, the way a man sets down a glass when he doesn't trust his own grip. And he sat back. "There's one more thing," Doyle said. "The theft report on the 11th floor. The tenant that filed it." Elias looked up. "It's a private security company," Doyle said. "Registered agent in Delaware. They held a services contract in that building for 1 year, and then didn't renew, and the corporation dissolved 14 months after the arrest. There's no officer listed I can put a face to. The address in the filing is a mailbox in a shipping store on Devon Avenue, and the store's under different ownership now, and the box was closed 6 years ago. I've got a name on the incorporation, but the man's been dead since before the company was formed. It's a wall." Elias sat very still. "Somebody," Doyle said, "put 2 items in that locker. Somebody knew which locker, and somebody kept calling for the next 5 years." Elias got up and went to the window. In the yard below, in a coat 2 sizes too big, Nora was sitting on the back step with a mug in both hands, while Dell said something to her from the doorway, and she was smiling at it. He watched her for a while. She'd been 20. She'd gone to class 4 nights a week and worked from 11 until 7, and she'd stopped, in the middle of all of that, for a stranger on a floor. And the entire remainder of her life, every closed door, and every eviction notice, and every winter under that bridge, had come out of it. Not because she was lazy, not because she'd failed at anything, because of 6 hours she'd never told a living soul about. "Whoever it was," Elias said. "Without turning around, they didn't do it once. They did it for 7 years. Doyle said, "Yes, sir." Then Elias said, "Don't tell her." On the 4th day, Nora went out to a laundromat on Halsted Street, with 2 bags of Dell's things, because Dell wouldn't let the housekeeper touch them, and Nora wouldn't let Dell carry them, and Doyle drove her, and stayed at the curb. She was folding at the long table in the back when a woman came and sat down on the bench across from her with a paper cup of coffee, and set a second one down in front of Nora without being asked. The woman was 44 years old. She had a government haircut and a coat off a rack, and the particular patience of somebody who's spent a career waiting outside buildings. "My name is Claire Whitlock," she said. "I'm a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and I've been working the Moretti organization for 6 years. Nora's hand stopped in the middle of a towel. "I know he's got a man in the car," Whitlock said. "He's not going to come in, because the second he does this becomes a scene, and Elias Moretti doesn't like scenes. So, we've got about 10 minutes, and I'd rather not waste them," Nora said. "I don't know anything." "That's fine," Whitlock said. "I'm not here about what you know." She put a folder on the table, thin, 3 or 4 sheets. She didn't open it. "Miss Keene," she said. "On the 9th of January, 7 years ago, you pleaded guilty to a felony in Cook County. Property found in your locker. No lawyer to speak of. You took 2 years probation, because the alternative was 5 years in Logan." And Nora, who had not heard anybody in 7 years say that out loud without a sneer in it, sat down slowly on the bench. Whitlock turned the folder around. "There is a way to undo that," she said. "Not seal it. Not expunge it. Undo it. If it can be shown the property was placed, the conviction gets vacated, and in this state, that opens a door to something called a certificate of innocence, which is not a pardon and is not mercy. It's a piece of paper from a judge that says it didn't happen. It comes off the background check, every one of them." Nora didn't move. "And the license," she said. Whitlock said, "The licensing board can't hold a conviction against you that doesn't exist anymore." Nora looked at the towel in her lap for a long moment. "And what do you want?" "I want the man in the car," Whitlock said. "I want the ledgers. I want the shell companies and the routes and the names. I've had 6 years, and I have never once had somebody inside that house who wasn't on his payroll, and I have never once had somebody he'd talk in front of. He's had you at that address for 4 days, and I know what that means, even if you don't." She let it sit there. She didn't lean forward, and she didn't lower her voice. She was not a woman who enjoyed this part, and she didn't pretend to. "I'm not going to tell you he's a good man," Whitlock said. "I'm not going to tell you he's a bad one either, because you were there and I wasn't. I'll tell you what he is on paper and let you decide." And Nora said, "Don't." Whitlock stopped. "All right," she said. Then she slid a business card across the table. Plain, a name, and an office number, and a cell number written on the back in pen. Nora looked at it. She looked at it for a long time, longer than Whitlock expected, and the machines went on turning behind them, and somebody's dryer buzzer went off, and nobody came for it. 7 years, Nora said. Whitlock waited. "In 7 years, nobody in this government could remember my name," Nora said. "I sat in a courtroom hallway, and a man in a suit called me by the last name of the girl ahead of me, and I corrected him twice. I applied for that license, and I got back a letter that said, 'Applicant.' Not Miss Keene. Applicant. I've stood in line at 3 agencies in this city with a folder of paper, and been sent home for the wrong form, and come back and been sent home again. I've had a caseworker tell me she couldn't find me in the system, and then ask me if I was sure I'd ever been in it." She looked up. "Now you need something from me, and all of a sudden I've got a name, and all of a sudden there's a door, and it's been there the whole time." Whitlock didn't defend it. She sat with it, which was more than most would have done. "That's fair," she said. "It's more than fair. It's true. I'd say I'm sorry, but I don't imagine you've got much use for that," Nora said. "No. Take the card anyway," Whitlock said. "I'm not asking you for anything today. I'm not going to threaten you. And if anybody from my office does, you call me and I'll deal with it. But I want you to understand one thing before I go, and then I'll leave you alone." Nora waited. Whitlock stood and put her coat on. "Whatever's happening in that house," she said, "it ends. It always ends. And when it ends, everybody standing near him goes down with him. And it doesn't matter one bit what they knew, or what they did, or what they were owed. It matters what they can prove. You're the only person in this city who's ever going to get offered a way out ahead of time. That's all." She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on it. "For what it's worth, Miss Keene," she said, and she said the name carefully. "The way you say a word you've decided to get right. I read the file on that arrest last night, and I've been doing this 20 years, and that locker was salted. Anybody who looks at it can see it. I don't know who did it to you." Then she went out. Nora sat there. After a while, she picked up the card and turned it over and looked at the handwriting on the back, and then she put it in the inside pocket of her coat, the one with the ticket in it, and she went back to folding. He didn't buy her anything. That was the part Dell kept waiting for and didn't get. No jewelry appeared on the table. No car turned up in the drive with a bow on it. Nothing arrived in a box, and by the end of the first week the old woman had begun watching him the way you watch a man whose hand you can't see. What he did instead was hire a lawyer. Not a criminal lawyer. A young woman from a legal aid clinic in Uptown, who spent most of her working life on eviction cases, and who came to the house on a Tuesday morning with a rolling briefcase and asked Nora, in a voice like a nurse taking a history, when she'd last had a state identification card that wasn't expired. Nora said she wasn't sure. 6 years. Maybe 7. The lawyer wrote that down. And Elias, who had spent 20 years learning that the fastest way through any wall in this country is a phone call to the man who owns the wall, made no phone call at all. He asked the lawyer what the correct order was. The lawyer said, "You can't get the identification card without the birth certificate, and you can't get the birth certificate without an identification card or 2 acceptable proofs, and that the second problem is the one that ends most people, because a person who's been outside for 3 winters doesn't have a utility bill or a lease or a bank statement, and a shelter letter is only good in some offices and not in others, depending on who's at the counter that day." Elias asked what the way through was. The lawyer said, "The way through is somebody sits with her and goes back every single time she gets sent home." It took 11 days. He drove her to the Vital Records office and waited in the car, and then, the second time, went in and stood against the wall by the window and said nothing, because she'd asked him not to speak for her. He watched a clerk hand back a form, because a box had been left empty that the same office had told her the week before to leave empty. He watched her say, "All right," and take it, and not argue, in the flat voice of a woman who'd stopped expecting to win arguments in rooms like that a long time ago. He watched her go back a 3rd time. On the 12th day, they went to a facility on the west side to get the state card. The line went out into the parking lot and it was cold, and they stood in it for 2 hours and 10 minutes with the lawyer's folder between them, and Dell had insisted on coming and sat on a bench inside the whole time, telling anybody who'd listen that in her day this took 20 minutes. When Nora finally got to the counter, she put the folder down and slid it across without saying anything, because she'd learned it was better to let the paper speak first. The clerk behind the glass was a man in his 50s, with reading glasses down his nose. He went through it. He checked one thing twice, then he looked up over the glasses at her, and he read the name off the birth certificate, out loud, the whole thing, the way it was written. Nora Elizabeth Keene. He said it correctly. He didn't hesitate at the middle name, and he didn't run the two halves together, and he didn't ask her to spell it. Then he said, "All right, Miss Keene, if you'll step over to the camera, we'll get your picture." And Nora Keene stood at that counter in a public office on the west side of Chicago, with 60 people in line behind her, and put both hands flat on the ledge and started to cry. Not the way people cry in rooms like that, which is usually anger with nowhere to go. She cried the way a person cries when a door opens that they'd stopped walking up to. She got quiet about it fast, and wiped her face with her sleeve and said sorry twice. And the clerk, who had been doing that job for 19 years and had seen a great many things at that window, said, "Take your time," and turned away and busied himself with something else, so she could have 30 seconds. Elias was standing 8 feet behind her against the wall. He'd been in a great many rooms in his life. He'd been in rooms where men who made decisions about the city of Chicago went quiet when he sat down, and rooms where his name alone had settled a thing that 4 other men couldn't settle in a year. He had, at that moment, an organization, a bank in another country, 4 buildings on Wacker Drive, a lawyer on retainer who'd never lost, and the private telephone numbers of 2 aldermen and a judge. And it occurred to him, standing against that wall, that he could have done this in an afternoon at any point in the last 7 years for anybody who asked him, that he'd used every ounce of what he had to move freight and men and money, and had never once in his life used a single ounce of it to hand a person back their own name, that the thing which had just broken this woman open in front of a room full of strangers was a middle-aged man behind glass reading 3 words off a page correctly, and that he'd been walking past people in that condition on his own sidewalks for 20 years, without so much as slowing down. Dell came up beside him with her cane and watched Nora go over to the blue backdrop for the photograph. "Well," the old woman said, "that's the first useful thing I've seen you do." Elias didn't answer her. He couldn't, just then. It started because Nora mentioned, in the way a person mentions a thing they don't intend to be heard, that her mother used to make a potato soup on the last week of the month when the money was gone, and that she'd never written the recipe down. Dell said she remembered the girl talking about it under the bridge, one January. And Elias, who had not cooked anything in 11 years, and who had a woman come 3 days a week to fill the refrigerator with food nobody ate, said, "Tell me how she made it." So on Thursday evening, Dell sat at the kitchen table with her cane hooked over the back of the chair and directed the operation like a woman calling a horse race. And Elias Moretti stood at the stove with his sleeves rolled to the elbow and a 5-pound bag of potatoes, and no idea what he was doing. Under her sharp supervision, he failed miserably at every basic step of the process. Within 10 minutes, the pot was scorched, and the kitchen was in mild disarray. Dell tasted the spoon, looked at the ceiling, and said, "You built an empire, and you can't boil a potato." Nora made a sound she immediately tried to smother with both hands, and it got away from her anyway, and then she was laughing, really laughing, doubled forward over the table with her forehead nearly on her wrist, the kind of laughing that has 7 years behind it and comes out sideways. Elias stood at the stove holding a wooden spoon and let her. He didn't say anything clever. He looked at her the way a man looks at weather he hasn't seen in a long time. Dell noticed him doing it and pretended not to. They ate it anyway, all 3 of them. It was scorched on the bottom and thin on top, and Dell ate 2 bowls of it out of pure contrariness and said it was the worst thing she'd been served since a hospital cafeteria in 1988. Afterward, when Dell had gone up, Nora took her coat out to the flat part of the roof off the 3rd floor, landing where there were 2 chairs nobody ever sat in, and Elias came out after a while with the 2 cups of coffee, neither of them needed, and handed her one. They sat. The city was doing its evening noise below them, brakes and a bus and somebody's dog. She had her feet pulled up under her in the chair. He watched her hold the cup with both hands the way she'd held one in a diner 10 days ago, and understood that she'd probably hold every cup that way for the rest of her life. After a while he said, "Can I ask you something?" She said, "All right." Elias turned his cup a half-turn on the arm of the chair. "That ticket," he said. "It's a train ticket. It's not registered to anybody. Any window agent in that station would have taken it off your hands, any day for 7 years, and given you $29 for it, or close to it." She didn't say anything. "There were nights you didn't eat," he said. "I've read what there is to read about those years. There was a February you were in an emergency room on Western Avenue for exposure. And that piece of paper was in your coat the whole time. $29. Nora looked out at the street. "Why didn't you ever sell it?" he said. The quiet went on a beat too long, then 2 beats. She lifted the coffee and drank some of it, and put it back down, and Elias watched her do all of it, and knew he'd hit something. Because it wasn't the silence of a woman deciding how to explain a sentimental thing to a man. There was no shyness in it. Her face had gone very still, the way it had gone still on that platform in the rain, and one hand had come across and closed around her own left forearm, over the sleeve, over the numbers, and she wasn't aware she'd done it. "It's cold out here," she said. He said, "Nora." "It's late," she said. "Dell takes something at 9, and she won't take it unless I bring it up." She stood, and she put a hand briefly on his shoulder as she went past, the first time she'd touched him at all, and then she went in through the door and it clicked shut behind her. Elias sat out on that roof for a long time, with 2 cups going cold on the chair arms. He'd built his life on reading men. He knew every shape a lie takes when it comes across a table at you, and what had just walked past him wasn't a lie, and it wasn't grief either. Or not only grief, it was the thing a person does when you've reached toward the one door in the house they've kept nailed shut. Whatever was behind it, she'd been carrying it alongside that ticket the entire time, and it was heavier than the ticket, and she'd never once set it down in front of anybody. She came back out an hour later. He was still in the chair. She stood in the doorway with her coat over her nightclothes and her arms folded, and she said, "You asked me a question," he said. "You don't have to answer it." "I know I don't," she said, and then she sat down and didn't say anything for a while, and Elias let the silence run, because he'd learned somewhere in the last 2 weeks that with this woman you don't reach. It came out sideways, the way these things do. "She started in the wrong place," she said. "My mother had multiple sclerosis. She said it was the kind that comes and goes, and that for years it mostly went, and that the year I'm talking about it stopped going. She said there were 4 prescriptions, and the one that mattered wasn't the expensive one. It was a nothing drug, a maintenance thing, but the pharmacy on Milwaukee Avenue wouldn't fill any of them until the balance cleared, and the balance was $26 and change." She stopped. She started again somewhere else. She said, "I had $411 in that account, and I want you to understand that $411 sounds like something and it isn't. The rent was $620, tuition was due." She said she'd been carrying the debit card that whole month like a live thing in her pocket. Then she stopped again, longer this time, and Elias understood that she was going to say it, and that she'd never said it out loud in 7 years, and that he should not move. She said, "The machine took $29. And she said, "So that was the pharmacy. That was the whole month. I went to the pharmacy on the 9th like I always did, and I stood there, and they told me the number, and I said I'd come back, and I did come back. But it wasn't for 3 weeks, because the check came on the 1st and I had to make the rent out of it first. And by then she'd been off it 22 days. Elias didn't say anything. She was looking at her own hands. "On the 11th of November, she said, she got up in the night, and she said nothing else about it. Not a word. She skipped it entirely, the way people do, and went straight to the other side. She said, after that she couldn't do the stairs. She said the apartment was a walk-up, and there was no elevator, and there was never going to be one, and that after that night her mother did not go down those stairs again, except in a chair with 2 men carrying her, 4 times, all 4 of them to a hospital. She said the last 2 years were not living. She said she wants to be honest about it, that it wasn't a tragedy with any dignity in it. It was a small apartment, and a bad chair, and a woman who used to work in a school office, and who by the end couldn't hold a cup. And she said, 22 days. It says in every one of those papers that consistency matters," she said. "I've read them. I've read them so many times." Then she said the thing that Elias would carry for the rest of his life, and she said it in a completely level voice. "I bought a stranger a train ticket," she said, "and my mother started dying 10 days later." She said, "That's not a feeling. I've had people tell me it's a feeling. It's arithmetic," she said. I did that. Then she was quiet, and Elias sat with it, and the city went on making noise below them. He didn't tell her it wasn't her fault. She'd have heard that 100 times from social workers and shelter volunteers, and it had never once landed. And if he said it now, she'd put him in with all of them and close the door. So he didn't. After a long time, he said, "Is that why you went into nursing?" And she laughed once, terribly, with no humor in it at all. She said she'd already been in it. She said she'd been 11 months in when it happened. And she said, "But afterward it stopped being a career," she said. "Afterward I was going to learn every single thing there was to know about how a body fails, so that I would never again in my life be the reason somebody didn't get what they needed." She said, "That was the whole plan. That was it." And she said, "I lasted one more term." She held her own left forearm the way she'd held it earlier. "And then they put those things in my locker," she said, "and it was over. And I have never been allowed near a patient since." Elias Moretti sat in the dark on that roof and understood, finally and completely, the size of what he'd walked away from on Canal Street 7 years earlier, with his hand under his coat. He'd thought all this time that he owed her 6 hours in a basement. He got up. He crossed to her chair, and he crouched down in front of it so that his eyes were below hers, the way a man does when he doesn't want to be the tall one in the conversation. And she looked at him with her face wrecked. He didn't touch her. He said one thing. He said, "You paid for my life with the most expensive thing you had." And then he said, "So from tonight, I live on that debt." She started to shake her head. He said, "No. Not I'll make it up to you. Not I'm sorry. Nothing a man says to close a subject." He said it the way you say a fact that's already true, and has been for 7 years, and has only now been read aloud. He said, "Every day I've had since that morning was bought with your mother's medicine, and I didn't know it, and now I do, and I'm not going to spend another one the way I spent the last 7. And Nora Keene put her hands over her face and let a man see her, and Elias stayed where he was, down on the concrete in front of her chair, and didn't move until she was finished. Gideon Vance came to the house on Saturday morning with the Cleveland file under his arm, and he was shown into the front room, and he was in the middle of a sentence about a shipping company in Ashtabula when Nora came down the back stairs to bring Dell her tea. The door between the hall and the front room stood open about a foot. She went past it. Then she stopped, and came back, and looked through the gap. Vance had his back half turned. He was saying something about a lease. She stood there with the cup and saucer in her hands, and Elias, who was facing the doorway, saw her face over Vance's shoulder, and saw the color go out of it in one motion, the way water goes out of a sink. The cup started ringing against the saucer. She took one step backward, then another, and then she was gone from the gap, and there was the sound of china breaking somewhere down the hall, and Elias was already standing. He said, "We'll finish this later." Vance said, "Sir, this is time sensitive." And Elias said, "Later," in a voice that ended it. And Vance gathered his file and inclined his head and went out to his car, politely, the way he did everything, and did not look back at the house. Elias found her in the kitchen with her back against the counter and the broken cup on the floor and both arms wrapped around herself. She wasn't crying. She was worse than that. She was shaking in a slow, continuous way that had nothing left of the present in it. Elias stopped in the doorway and kept his hands where she could see them and said, "Tell me." She said, "Who is that man?" He said, "His name is Gideon Vance. He worked for my father before he worked for me. 20 years. Nora said, "No." Elias waited. She said, "That's the man from the hospital." And then she couldn't get any more of it out for a moment, and she pressed the heel of her hand against her mouth, and then she took it away and said the rest fast, as if speed would get her through it. She said it was the 3rd or 4th day her mother was in. The second admission. She couldn't remember which. She said she'd gone down to the vending machines at some hour of the night and come back up, and there was a man standing at the foot of the bed. Not a doctor. Coat on. Hands folded. Her mother asleep. She said he was extremely polite. That was the thing she remembered most. That he was polite the whole time. That he asked her how her mother was doing and waited for the answer. And then he told her he'd come to give her some information she'd want. And that the information was that Elias Moretti had died in October of that year, that he'd been dead since the night she was thinking of, and that there was no point in her ever thinking about it again. And then, still perfectly pleasant, he said that a young woman with a sick mother should be careful about the things she says out loud, and that if that name ever came out of her mouth again in front of anybody, ever, For the rest of her life, they would come back, and it wouldn't be him who came. And he looked at the bed while he said it. Elias didn't move. She said, "I never knew who you were," she said. "I never asked you, and you didn't tell me. And I would never have known the name at all if that man hadn't stood at the foot of my mother's bed and put it in my mouth." And then she said, "And I found out I couldn't get rid of it." She said she'd said it in her sleep for 7 years. She said it was the only name she had. Elias said, "How did he find you?" And Nora said, "I've had 7 years to think about that," she said. "It's the machine." She said the ticket has the time printed on the bottom of it, 5:14 in the morning, and it was a card transaction. And there were exactly 2 people in that hall at 5:14 in the morning, and one of them was a woman in a uniform with a service contractor's badge. She said, "Anybody who could get the transaction could get to me in a day." She said, "I worked that out in the 2nd year." And she looked up at him and said the worst part of it flatly, without accusation, as a woman stating what she'd assumed all along. She said, "I always thought you sent him." And that was the moment. Elias Moretti had 3 seconds in that kitchen, and everything that happened afterward came out of what he did with them. On one side was a homeless woman he'd known for 2 weeks, standing in his kitchen with broken china at her feet, telling him that the man who'd been beside him at every funeral and every table and every bad night for 20 years, who'd carried his father's coffin, who'd been on that platform holding an umbrella he didn't open, had gone to a hospital ward 7 years ago and threatened a dying woman's daughter into silence. On the other side was Gideon Vance, and the whole architecture of Elias's life since he was 17. He didn't take the 3 seconds. He said, "I believe you." Nora looked at him. He said it again, plainly. "I believe you, Nora. I never sent anybody. I looked for you for 7 years and I never found you. And now I know why." She started to say something and he shook his head. He said, "Listen to me, because we have about a minute." He said, "From this moment you don't say his name in this house, or on a phone, or to Dell. If he comes back here, you're upstairs with the door shut. If he speaks to you, you're polite, and you're stupid, and you're grateful, and you don't remember anything." Nora said, "Why?" And Elias said, "Because he doesn't know that you know him. That's the only thing we've got." Vance came back on Monday at 11 in the morning, uninvited, with a folder he didn't need to deliver in person, and Elias understood the moment the car came up, the drive that Saturday had cost him. A man doesn't spend 20 years reading another man without learning to read the ending of a sentence. He had perhaps a week before Vance moved, and he needed 3 of it, and there was only one thing in that house he could put on the table to buy the time. He went upstairs. Nora was at the window in the back bedroom with her coat already on, because she'd seen the car too. Elias stood in the doorway and looked at her and did not explain, because there wasn't a version of the explanation that would survive the next 10 minutes, and if she knew, she'd play it badly, and Vance would see it. He said, "Come downstairs." Then he went down ahead of her. Vance was in the front room. Elias sat on the arm of a chair with his ankle over his knee and let the silence go on until Nora came in. And then he looked at her the way a man looks at furniture he's decided to get rid of. "Miss Keene," he said, "sit down." She didn't. Elias took an envelope out of his inside pocket, the one Doyle had brought up an hour before, and he opened his hand and let it drop onto the low table between them. It landed heavily. "It's 10,000, he said. "That's more than fair." Nora looked at the envelope, and then at him. Vance stood by the window with his hands folded, watching, and Elias felt the man's attention on the side of his face like a lamp. He made himself go on. He said, "I've had 2 weeks to look at this, and I'm going to be straight with you, because I don't think you're a stupid woman. You came to me with a piece of paper and a story about a night I barely remember, and I gave you a bed and a lawyer and a state identification card, and that's the account settled." He said, "I don't know what you thought this was." He said, "If it's the roof was temporary. If it's the rest of it, then I've been unclear, and that's my fault, and I'm clearing it up now." Nora said, "Elias," and he said, "Don't." He said it flatly. He said, "You were a cleaner in a basement." He said, "I've had a great many people do things for me over the years, and I've paid every one of them. And this is what payment looks like. And there's nothing after it." He let that sit. Then he did the last part, the part he'd known since the stairs that he was going to have to do. And he did it without softening a syllable. He said, "And take the old woman with you. She's not a house guest. She's a fixture I inherited. And I'm not running a shelter in Lincoln Park." Something happened in Nora's face. It wasn't anger. He'd have given anything for anger. It was the look of a woman watching the last load-bearing wall in the house come down slowly and without noise, and finding that she'd known all along it would, and that the only surprise was how long it had stayed up. She said, "All right." That was all she said. Not one word more. She stood there a moment longer, and Elias made himself hold her eyes and give her nothing back. Absolutely nothing. And it was the hardest thing he had ever done in his life. Harder than the alley on Taylor Street. Harder than the boiler room. Harder than his father's hand on the tile. Then she turned around and went upstairs. She was down again in 4 minutes. She had Dell by the elbow and Dell's plastic bag in her other hand, and Dell was saying something and Nora was shaking her head at her. Once. Hard. And the old woman stopped and looked at Elias across that room with an expression he would not forget and did not deserve to. Nora had her old coat on. Not the good one that had been bought for her. The one from the bridge. The one she'd come in with. And in the pocket of it was the ticket. And that was everything she took out of that house. She went past the low table without slowing down. The envelope was still lying on it. She didn't look at it. She got the front door open with her elbow because both hands were full, and Doyle was in the hall and moved to help her. And Elias said, "No." And Doyle stopped. And then the door closed, and the room was quiet, and the $10,000 was still sitting on the table exactly where it had landed. Vance let out a breath. "Sir," he said, and there was genuine relief in it, and something else underneath that Elias filed away. That was the right call. It was becoming an exposure. Elias said, "Get out." Vance blinked. Elias said, "I've had enough of your face this morning. Send me the Ashtabula numbers by 5. Vance said, "Of course," and took his coat, and went. And the car went down the drive. When it was gone, Elias sat down on the arm of the chair again, and put his hand over the lower part of his face, and stayed like that. Doyle came in and stood in the middle of the room. He looked at the envelope on the table. Then he looked at his employer. In 11 years, Silas Doyle had said perhaps 40 personal sentences to Elias Moretti, and he said one now. "You just did the right thing," he said, in the worst way it could be done. Elias didn't take his hand away from his mouth. Then he said, "Go." "Sir." "Both of them," Elias said. 2 blocks back. Doyle, if either one of them gets on a bus, you're on that bus. If they go under that bridge, you sit on that bridge all night. You don't let them see you, and you don't leave them alone for 1 hour. And if anything comes near them, anything at all, you don't call me first." Doyle said, "Yes, sir," and went out the back. They went back under the bridge because there was nowhere else, and the second night the notices went up on the fence posts, printed that afternoon, giving the occupants of the property 72 hours. Nobody under that viaduct had ever been told who owned the ground. It had sat vacant for 11 years. The notices went up on a Tuesday, and the crews came at 6:20 on Wednesday morning, which was 52 hours later. And by then, it was still dark, and it was 29 degrees. Nora heard the engines first. She came out with her boots half on. There were 3 trucks and a machine on a flatbed, and men in yellow vests with clipboards. And one of them was walking the line of shelters with a bullhorn telling people they had 15 minutes to remove personal property. 15 minutes. Somebody down the row started to argue about the notice, and the man with the bullhorn said, "Sir, take it up with the owner." Nora got her arms around Dell and got her upright and got her out. It went fast after that. They came down the row with the loader and pushed, and the tarps folded in on themselves. And behind the loader came 2 men with rakes and a truck, and everything went into the truck. Not a box. Not a pallet on the side for people to come back for. The truck. Somebody's coat went in. Somebody's papers. A woman was on her knees in the gravel trying to get her hands into a pile, and a man in a vest kept saying, "Ma'am, please step back. Ma'am, please step back." Dell stood in front of their shelter. She was 72 years old, and she was in a coat over a coat with her cane in one hand, and she planted herself, and she did not move. Nora had her by the arm. "Dell," she said. "Dell, come on." But the old woman had gone somewhere else. Her whole body was shaking, and Nora couldn't tell how much of it was the cold. She was saying something to the man with the clipboard, not loudly. A nurse's voice. 31 years of a nurse's voice. She was saying, "There are people here on medication." She was saying, "Where is it going?" She was saying, "That bag has my sister's rosary in it, and I'm going to ask you one more time." The man said he was sorry. He probably was. He was making $18 an hour, and he had a work order in his hand, and he moved on down the line because that's what the work order said to do. And the loader came forward. Dell stood her ground, raised her walking stick horizontally, like a wooden gate directly in front of the machine, and yelled for them to stop. Then her free hand clutched her coat. Her knees gave way, and she collapsed onto the wet gravel, the cane rolling away from her hand. Nora was on the ground before the sound finished. She got Dell onto her back. She got the coat open. She put 2 fingers where 31 years of hospital floors had taught the old woman herself to put them, and the woman she'd learned it from was under her hands and going gray. Nora screamed for somebody to call 911. She screamed it at the whole gravel lot. 20 people heard her. The machine kept going. The man with the bullhorn was 40 feet away with his back turned. 2 men in vests looked over and then looked at each other and kept working, because it wasn't their scope, and there was a supervisor somewhere, and somebody else would handle it. On the sidewalk above the embankment, a man stopped walking, took out his phone, held it up, and filmed. Then a second one did. A woman on the far side of the fence stood watching with a grocery bag on her arm for maybe 10 seconds, and then walked on. A car slowed at the light, and the window came down 2 inches, and the window went back up, and the car went through the intersection. Somebody said, "Is she okay?" from 20 feet away, and didn't come any closer, and then that person left too. Nora had her hands on Dell's chest and she was counting out loud and she was screaming between counts. "Please, somebody, please, call." And her voice was going raw, and the loader was running, and the phones were up. Nobody stopped. She did the compressions herself. She'd learned them in a classroom 8 years ago, in a program she was never allowed to finish, and she'd never once used them on a human being. And she did them now on a gravel embankment under a viaduct on the Chicago River with her knees soaked through and her breath going up white in the cold. She counted to 30 and she breathed, and she counted to 30 again. Her arms were shaking by the second minute. She said, "Don't you dare." She said, "You don't get to do this." She said, "Dell, I'm here. I'm right here." Somebody behind her finally said, I called them," and Nora didn't turn around to see who. 4 minutes. 5. The men in vests had backed the loader off and were standing in a loose half circle now, 10 feet out, watching, useless, because nobody had told them what to do about this. 6 minutes. And then Nora heard something that wasn't a siren, and it came from the wrong direction. It came from the street, tires on gravel, fast, and a car door, and running feet on the embankment behind her, and a voice she knew saying, "Move, get back, move." Doyle had been on that embankment for 2 days and 1 night, without either woman knowing it, in a gray sedan up on the street, with a thermos and a phone, and he'd made the call at 6:24 before the crews reached the 4th shelter, and Elias had come from Lincoln Park in 11 minutes on wet streets in the dark. He came down the gravel with his coat open. He said, "Move," and the half-circle of men in vests came apart in front of him without anybody deciding to, and he went down on his knees on the other side of Dell from Nora, and put his hand on Nora's shoulder and said, "Keep going. I've got you. Don't stop." She kept going. He counted with her out loud. At minute 8, the ambulance came in off the street, with Doyle standing in the middle of the road waving it down the wrong way, and the paramedics took over, and Nora sat back on her heels with her arms shaking so badly she couldn't get them under herself. Elias picked the old woman up off the gravel. He didn't wait to be told he could. He got one arm under her shoulders and one under her knees, and he lifted her. And he carried her the 40 feet to the back of that ambulance himself, in front of the men with the clipboards and the men with the phones, and he did not look at a single one of them. He put her down on the cot. A paramedic said, "Sir, family only," and Elias said, "I'm going," and got in, and put his hand out for Nora, and Nora took it. The doors closed. Somewhere behind them the loader had shut off. At the hospital they took Dell through the doors and a nurse brought a clipboard out to the waiting area and gave it to Nora, and Nora sat down with it on her knees and couldn't do it. Her hands wouldn't hold the pen. She got the first 2 letters of the last name, and the pen came off the paper, and she tried again, and it came off again, and she said, "I can't," and there was something coming apart in her voice. Elias sat down beside her. He didn't take the clipboard. He didn't take the pen out of her hand and do it for her. He put his hand over the back of hers and closed it, and held it steady, and let her push. She signed it. 7 years earlier, in a basement in a train station, a girl had put her whole weight on a stranger's hand to keep it where it needed to be, and neither of them said anything about that now. Then it was a waiting room in the dark part of the morning, and the two of them sat in those chairs side by side for 4 hours. Nora had gravel in both knees of her pants. Elias had it on his coat. Nobody came out for a long time. Around 3, she said, without turning her head. You didn't mean it. Monday, he said. No, she said. Why? And Elias Moretti, who could have taken 20 minutes to explain the position he'd been in, and how many days he'd needed, and what a man like Gideon Vance does when he sees a soft place in his employer, said one sentence. He said, because if he'd believed you mattered to me, he'd have gone at you first, and he'd have done it before I was ready. That was all. He didn't decorate it. Nora sat with it. Then she said, you could have told me, he said. You'd have played it badly. He'd have seen it in your face in 4 seconds. She thought about that for a while, and then she said, that's probably true, and something in her shoulders came down an inch. A long time later, she said, 7 years ago I saved you. Elias shook his head. No, he said. 7 years ago you taught me you're supposed to stop. She looked at him then. He was looking straight ahead at the doors. She's been carrying you since that first winter, he said, and this morning she stood in front of a machine for you at 72 years old. And 20 people watched it happen. He said, I've walked past that. He said, for 20 years I have walked past exactly that, on my own street, in my own city, and I never once turned my head. At 5:20, a doctor came out and asked for the family of Delphine Rooney. And Nora stood up so fast the chair went back. He told them the old woman had gone into a cardiac event, that the compressions she'd received on scene were the reason there was anything to work with when the ambulance arrived, that they'd stabilized her, and that she was not out of the woods, but she was through the worst of it and she was talking. He said the first thing she'd said was to ask what they'd done with her bag. Nora put both hands over her face and stood there in the middle of that hallway, and Elias put his hand between her shoulder blades and left it there, and neither of them said anything for a while. They let her in at 6. Dell was gray and small in the bed with a line in the back of her hand, and she opened one eye at Elias and said, You're still here. And Elias said, I'm still here. And she said, and closed the eye again. Out in the corridor, in the gray light, Nora reached into the inside pocket of the old coat. She took out something and looked at it and turned it over. And then she took Elias's hand and put it into his palm and folded his fingers over it. It was a business card. Plain. An office number on the front and a cell number written on the back in pen. And a name. Claire Whitlock. She came to me at the laundromat, Nora said. 2 weeks ago. I never called her. Elias looked at the card in his hand for a long moment. Then he said, They burned everything she owned this morning because of me. Nora said, No. Because of him. She said, And you know it. And you've known it since Saturday. And I'm not going back under a bridge. And neither is she said. So do something about him. Elias closed his hand around the card. Doyle came to the house on Thursday night with a ledger book in a plastic bag, and he'd gotten it out of a storage unit in Bridgeport that had been paid for in cash for 19 years by a man who kept his own accounts because he'd never in his life trusted anybody to keep them for him. It was an ordinary book. Green cloth overboard, the kind you buy in a stationery store. Elias sat at the kitchen table and went through it page by page for 2 hours, and Doyle stood by the door the whole time and didn't sit down. It was all there. Because men like Gideon Vance don't write things down for anybody else. They write them down for themselves, and a man's own arithmetic is the most honest thing he ever produces. There were the shell companies, 4 of them, and the private security firm that had filed the theft report on the 11th floor, and the mailbox on Devon Avenue, and a monthly figure paid out for 5 years to a man with a telephone. There was a lot in Bridgeport under the river bought in the 3rd year with cash, and there was an entry in the October of 7 years ago, 4 days before a Thursday dinner on Taylor Street, for a payment out to 2 names that Elias had never heard, followed by a second payment 11 days later, and next to the second one, in Vance's small level hand, the word incomplete. Elias read that word 3 times. The whole architecture came apart quietly in his head and rebuilt itself in another shape. Not Cleveland, not Kessler, who'd been a rival for 19 years and an enemy for 7, and had never in all that time laid a hand on the Moretti family because he hadn't done it in the first place, and had spent 7 years absorbing a war he'd never started and couldn't understand. 3 men had died in a room in Cleveland 2 weeks ago because of that war. Elias's own men. There were others going back years on both sides. All of it out of one line in a stationery book. He sat there and understood the rest of it in order, the way you understand a thing you've refused to look at. Vance had opened that kitchen door. Vance had put a man in it. And Vance had planned for 2 funerals that October and gotten one, because a 20-year-old girl on a cleaning contract had pulled a stranger through a doorway into the dark and lied to 2 men at the bottom of a stairwell. That was the whole margin. That was all the room there had been. And Vance, who could not go back and finish it once Elias was upright and surrounded, had gone instead to a hospital ward and stood at the foot of a sick woman's bed, and then had spent 7 years methodically taking a life apart, piece by piece, a phone call every 3 months for 5 years, so that if the girl ever did open her mouth, she'd be a convicted thief with no license and no address, and no one on earth who'd believe a word she said. He had made her unable to testify. That was the entire purpose. Elias closed the book. Doyle said, "Sir, say the word." Elias said no. He sat for a while with his hand flat on the green cloth. He was aware of what he was, and what the room upstairs would look like in a month, and what his father would have done, which was the simplest thing in the world and would have taken 4 hours. And he was aware that if he did it, the ledger burned with the man, and the arrest stood. And Nora Keene was a felon for the rest of her life, and every year of what had been done to her stayed done. He said, "Get me the phone." Claire Whitlock came to a diner on Ashland Avenue at 7 the next morning with no vehicle behind her because he'd asked, and she sat down across from him, and he put the ledger on the table between them and slid it over. She didn't touch it for a moment. She said, "What is this?" He said, "That's Gideon Vance's private accounts, 19 years, in his handwriting." He said, "That's my father," he said, "and that's the theft report on Nora Keene, and the shell that filed it, and the man he paid to make the calls." Whitlock opened it. She read for 4 minutes without saying anything. Then she closed it and looked at him and said, "And what do you want, Mr. Moretti?" And Elias said, "I want to give you the rest of it. The routes, the companies, the bank in Grand Cayman, names," he said. "I'll sit for it," he said, "and I'll plead." Whitlock sat very still. She'd worked this man for 6 years. She said, "You understand what you're saying?" He said, "I've spoken to a lawyer. I know what the exposure is, and I know there's no version of this where I walk out of it. And I'm not asking for one." She said, "Then what are you asking for?" He said, "One condition." He said, "The evidence in that book goes to the state's attorney in Cook County, and the conviction against Nora Keene gets vacated, and she gets the certificate." He said, "That's it. That's the whole condition. There isn't a second one." Whitlock looked at him for a long moment across that table. She said, "You're trading an empire for a name." Elias said, "That name's worth more." They took Vance on a Tuesday morning outside a coffee place on Wells Street, and it was done so quietly that a man at the next table went on reading his paper. He was polite about it, the way he was polite about everything. He asked whether he could make a call. He was charged 11 days later with 2 homicides and a racketeering count, and a great deal else, and he never once gave a reason for any of it, in that room or in any room after, and nobody was ever able to say whether it had been money or 20 years of standing one step behind a chair he thought should have been his. Elias Moretti signed his agreement in April. He gave up the organization, the buildings on Wacker Drive, and the account in the Caymans, and he pleaded to a single count with a cooperation motion attached, and the judge gave him 30 months. In June, in a courtroom on California Avenue that took 11 minutes, a judge vacated the conviction of Nora Elizabeth Keene, and Nora stood up when her name was called and answered, "Present." 2 years later, on a Saturday afternoon in a light rain, Elias Moretti came into Union Station 20 minutes early and stood under the great glass ceiling and waited. He'd served 26 months. He came out to a rented apartment in Bridgeport, and a job he'd taken because a man he'd known since he was 19 had offered it, running the front office of a truck repair shop on the South Side, 41 hours a week. With a payroll of 11 and a bookkeeping system, he'd rebuilt himself in his first month, because the old one was a shoebox. There were mornings the work bored him so badly he could taste it. He kept showing up. Dell came in through the Canal Street doors first, 74 years old and moving on a cane, and she stopped inside the entrance to fold her umbrella, and then stood there long enough to tell a man in his 30s that he was carrying his the wrong way and was going to take somebody's eye out with it. The man apologized. Dell said that was the first sensible thing anybody had said to her all day, and went on through. She lived in a one-bedroom in Uptown now, in a building with an elevator, which she complained about constantly on the grounds that it made her lazy. Nora came in behind her. She was 29. She'd gotten the certificate in the September after the courtroom, a single page from a judge, and she kept it in a folder, in a drawer, and had never once framed it. She'd re-enrolled that spring, and she was 11 weeks from sitting the licensing exam, and she studied at a kitchen table from 9 at night until 1 in the morning 4 nights a week. The other days she ran a small program out of 2 rooms in a church basement on the west side, 6 volunteers and 1 part-time attorney. And what they did there was not glamorous. They sat with people. They ordered birth certificates. They went back to the same counter a 3rd time and a 4th. They found 7 people in the first year whose convictions were bad and got 2 of them undone. And Nora Keene, who had once stood at a window and been called applicant, learned all of their names on the first visit and used them every time. She came across the main hall with her hair damp and her bag over her shoulder, and she saw him standing there and said, "You're early." Elias said, "I've learned to respect trains." Dell said, "He's been early to everything for 2 years. It's exhausting." They went down to platform 2. Elias pulled 2 blank train tickets from his jacket, handed them to her and said, "All those years ago, on a night just like this, you bought me a ticket out of this city. Let me buy 2 back, on the condition that we ride together." Nora covered her mouth and smiled through tears. "On one condition," she said, "the next time you miss a train, don't you dare call it bad luck." He laughed out loud, and she pulled him up by the front of his coat, holding him tight while Dell watched with a knowing grin. There's something worth sitting with in what happened to those 2 people. A great many of the men and women we walk past on the sidewalk are not sitting there because they were lazy or careless or unwilling. Some of them are sitting there because they did the right thing at the wrong moment, and one door closed on them and then another, and nobody came back to check. And in the end, power was never the number of people who had to do what Elias Moretti said. It was the number of times he was willing to stop for someone who had nothing to offer him. That's a kind of wealth any of us can carry, and it costs nothing but attention. If this story moved you, please give it a like, share it with somebody who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you can join us for a new story every day. And I'd really like to know what you thought. Have you ever been the person who stopped for a stranger? Or the person a stranger stopped for? Is there someone in your life who kept believing in you long after the world stopped? Tell us in the comments, in your own words, from the heart, because those comments are read, and they matter more than you know. Thank you for spending this time with us. We wish you good health, a peaceful heart, and quiet joy in your days ahead. Take care of yourself, take care of the people around you, and we'll see you in the next video.